Environment Journal's EnviroExchange webinar series. My name is Corinne Lynds, and I'm the content director here at Actual Media. Today, with support from Milestone Environmental Contracting, I'm excited to be hosting this discussion about contaminated site cleanups. By now, you've probably noticed everyone's checking in on the right-hand side of the chat feature. Please say hello, let us know who you are, where you're from. Certainly a report on the weather is always appreciated since we're good Canadians. Right above the chat, you're going to see an Actual Media icon. If you click follow, you'll continue to be updated on our EnviroExchange series as new webinars are announced. And down below, you'll see a variety of information. You can see how many people are signed in to today's webinar. You'll see the polls feature where we encourage you to cast your votes. You'll also see a little green button with rotating links to the speakers' websites. So be sure to check those out as well. And most importantly, in my opinion, is the Ask a Question feature. So don't be shy about becoming part of the conversation. I'll do my best to pose your questions to our panelists throughout the discussion where it's most appropriate. We have an impressive lineup of speakers joining us for this important discussion. But before I jump in and introduce them, I would like to take a few moments to acknowledge the many First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada as the original stewards of this great country. I'm here in Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We all share in the responsibility of our natural infrastructure, and there is much we can learn from the traditional knowledge of the land, water, and materials that allow us to build projects that benefit all Canadians. All right, so let's begin and meet our experts. I am going to begin by inviting each of our panelists to the screen. Once they're on screen, I'll give each of them just a moment or two to introduce themselves and quickly tell us a bit about where they're from, what their role is, and what perspective that they're bringing to today's discussion. First up, we have Joanna Vince from Wilmsden Shire. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Krista Barfoot from Stantec. There she is. Welcome, Krista. And then we have Reanne Ridsdale from the newly named Toronto Metropolitan University. Welcome, Reanne.
Hello.
And rounding out our panel is Eric Pringle from Milestone Environmental Contracting. I'm sure he'll be here in just a moment. There he is. Hi, Eric.
Morning.
Thanks. All right. So Canada's record on contaminated site cleanups has been controversial at times. If you think back to the notorious Sydney tar ponds in Nova Scotia. However, Canada's had some pretty big wins too. Today, we'll be talking about some of those, including Randle Reef project from right here in Ontario. And I believe it was the largest remediation project in the Canadian Great Lakes. So lots of good information for us to get there. I'm looking forward to hearing about the projects, but there's also some other big topics for us to dive into. Best practices in site cleanup, federal initiatives, provincial programs, disparity in the rules and regulations that vary from province to province. This panel discussion will cover a lot of that good stuff. And we're also going to look and see the terms of environmental, sustainable, and inclusive strategies across Canada. We're going to look at all of that good stuff. So enough of me. Let's jump in and talk to our experts. Eric, I am going to pick on you at first, as I promised I would. Milestone was one of the key partners involved in the cleanup of Randle Reef. Can you tell us a bit about that project and the techniques in which the project team approached the remediation?
Sure, happy to. Do you want me to introduce myself first, or are we going to go right?
Oh yeah, well, I maybe just sailed right through today, didn't I? Let's do that. Sorry, thank you.
And I'm happy.
Eric, why don't you start first, and then we'll do all the intros, and then we'll.
For sure. So my name's Eric Pringle. I'm the managing partner and CEO of Milestone Environmental Contracting. I'm based here in Langley, BC, but we're based across Canada. And while I've been in contracting for almost 8 years, 10 years, I had a long career prior to that in environmental contracting. So happy to join the crowd here today. I grew up in Toronto, and I've got to say that I live with a very avid Leafs fan. So maybe that's appropriate to kick us off.
Fair enough. All right. I'm just going to go around. Krista, why don't you introduce yourself now too, please?
Sure. I'm Krista Barfoot. I'm a principal with Stantec Consulting in the Waterloo office. But like Milestone, Stantec has also got offices across Canada and around the world. I've been working in environmental consulting for about 20 years now with a very strong focus on contaminated sites and specifically the use of risk assessment and risk management measures to support the cost-effective redevelopment of these sites. So my focus has really become supporting the development of site strategies that will help to produce cost-effective and schedule-effective redevelopment processes for these sites. And I'm also near Toronto, so I also live with a Leafs fan.
Awesome. All right, Joanna, over to you.
Thanks, and thanks for having me today. Looking forward to the great discussion today. So my name's Joanna Vince. I'm a partner at Wilms & Shire Environmental Lawyers, LLP. I'm also a certified specialist in environmental law by the Law Society of Ontario. I'm called to the bar, licensed to practice here in Ontario, where I am now, as well as the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and the Yukon. I, along with others at my firm, spend a significant amount of my time working on contaminated sites work. This includes buying and selling contaminated properties or businesses that own contaminated properties, and working with clients on the redevelopment of contaminated properties. I also spend time negotiating with provincial or federal regulators on behalf of clients and challenging regulatory orders, defending prosecutions, and bringing or defending civil lawsuits, all arising from contaminated land. I live close to Toronto, but we are actually not hockey fans. We are basketball fans, so we are Raptors fans.
Excellent.
So sorry to break the trend, but
No, that's okay. It's good to cover off our full range of sports fans. All right, Reanne, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Reanne Ridsdale. I'm a PhD candidate at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm sure we're probably all aware, but it's the new name of Ryerson University. I'm originally from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and I moved out to Toronto for my PhD. But now I'm actually in Manitoba, so I just thought I'd, let everyone know that it's not a Toronto-centric panel. And I'm actually on holidays right now in Phoenix, so hopefully there's no distractions. And I'm sick, so if I have to pause my camera to sneeze and cough, that's where I've gone, but I'll be right back. So my role as a PhD candidate and a researcher, I'm investigating how we can maximize beneficial output of brownfield projects, either through the remediation process, and especially what I'm looking at is kind of the after the end use of brownfield sites. So originally my background was looking at sustainable remediation and understanding how sustainability discourse could help brownfield projects. And now I'm more looking at how we can actually maximize to increase social justice in brownfield projects for marginalized communities.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's great. I'm excited. I was so excited. I was trying to dive in way ahead of your introduction. So awesome. Okay, Eric, let's try again. Why don't you tell us about Randle Reef?
Sure. Thanks. So Randle Reef, as some of you may know, an exciting project and certainly had many excellent aspects to it. Located in Hamilton Harbor, it involved the cleanup of a lot of the legacy issues in Hamilton Harbor, obviously from steel manufacturing and heavy industry. But I think one of the key aspects that made it kind of unique is that all of that remediation, all of the materials were kept on site and handled on site. In addition, the site was remediated in such a way with an engineered containment facility such that the port is now able to build off that containment facility and actually create new land and new port infrastructure. So it had a whole series of kind of unique aspects. The project was recognized through the Brownie Awards last year for the Reinvest category. And I think, there's a link there because as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I don't get 1,000 words today. So there's a whole bunch of pictures. There's a couple of links. But basically our scope of the work, which was phase 2, involved the cleanup involving dredging and capping of the harbor, and then that engineered containment cell. Water management was a key aspect because as all that material was placed in the engineered cell and then used as basically the foundation for that future port area, all that water had to be managed, treated, and then discharged. And so many different aspects of the projects. Actually at Remtech East, I think next month, Wayne Harris, who was our project manager, will be talking about it. The project involves kind of a unique funding sharing arrangement where both government and private sector contributed funds for the cleanup. And a big part of that was obviously bringing back the harbor. And there's a number of different elements publicly available in terms of all the accomplishments that were achieved. One of the key things that I thought would be interesting to talk about today in terms of that innovation piece was just around the collaboration between the owner and all the different stakeholders in that ownership group, the engineer who was responsible for the remediation plan, and then us and our team as a contractor. And our team, what we did, partly for capacity and partly for expertise, is we actually created a joint venture with Fraser River Pile and Dredge to execute on the project. And there was an important piece of that collaboration that I wanted to just mention, which was that there was a value added component in the contract. So all the contractors closed on the project, submitted their plans, submitted their prices, but then there was an ability to bring forward after close value-added engineering components that could be benefit to the project. And in our case, we had two, which I think were really important because they helped us not only with the constructability, so it made the project more feasible, but it also created some benefits in terms of safety, and it created some financial benefits for the client. And so that value added piece benefited in terms of the drainage. So originally the design for the engineered containment cell had a certain approach that was proposed. We came up with a different one, which was more cost effective and most importantly was safer, but it also enhanced that constructability. And then the other one was just in terms of the dredging method. So as you can imagine, there's years of planning and preparation that goes into the engineering and a huge amount of work, good work by a whole bunch of people. But I think that constructability piece and how we're actually going to accomplish it for the sort of most cost effective or best value way is a piece that if we can leave that open with some of those ideas within our contracting, we focus on better outcomes, and that's a big benefit. So for Milestone, what we often talk about is try to bring the contractors in early, brainstorm some of those ideas, and in our case, we're always happy to do that because we love to collaborate. So that project in terms of Randle Reef is now finished, phase 2. There's a little bit of work that's finishing up, but the water treatment facility, for example, has been demobilized. And so that is now paving the way for phase 3, which will actually be the finishing off of that containment facility and then the preparation to be new portlands.
Wow. It's no doubt that these are some seriously complex projects. I'm curious, Joanna, with your expertise in environmental law, what can you tell us about the current regulations that are available to guide cleanup of contaminated sites like these? And what are the carrot sticks available in the current legal framework? And I mean, it's a long question now, but and how are these emerging policies for climate action coming into play? I'm sure that maybe you need more than 1,000 words for all of that as well, but I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, that might be a thesis, as Reanne was talking about earlier. That might be mine. So thanks. It's a good question. It is a big question, and I'll do my best to answer it in the time we have. So most provinces and territories have some combination of laws, regulations, and guidelines that set out the general requirements for environmental investigations and cleanups at contaminated sites. The requirements can vary a lot between different jurisdictions, so it's very, very important to know the rules and the requirements for where your property is located. Federal sites have their own rules and guidelines, and there may be even federal laws that apply even to non-federal sites. So for example, if the site might be impacting fish through different discharges through water or groundwater, there could be Fisheries Act requirements to be aware of. Similarly, PCBs are something that's also regulated federally, and those regulations might apply if you have a PCB issue at your site. Using Ontario as an example, because that is where I do the majority of my work, the Ontario Environmental Protection Act and the Brownfields regulations here form the basis of the Brownfields regime, which is then supplemented by guidelines and technical documents. The regime sets out the requirements for phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments, including the content to be included in the reports, and for example, when a phase 2 might or must be completed. This framework also sets out when a cleanup or remediation to the applicable standards or risk assessment must be completed. So in Ontario, for example, a building permit cannot be issued by the municipal chief building official if there's a change to a more sensitive use until the landowner obtains a record of site condition under the Brownfields framework. The record certifies that the property either meets the standards or that there's a risk assessment that's been accepted by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks that documents no risk to human health or to ecology. Several of the Brownfield frameworks across Canada provide a record or certificate or a letter on completion of the cleanup that not only certifies that the property is clean, which is important for restoring value to property in some cases, but it also provides some protection from liability. So again, in Ontario, your record of site condition provides the owner and all subsequent owners of the property with limited protection from ministry orders. So there's one of those benefits of getting that record, that carrot to do that cleanup work, do it to the regulatory framework and obtain the record, is you get that protection, which for many clients helps them sleep at night knowing that they're not going to be facing that ministry order. It can, it's that peace of mind. And we've seen these records be not used also as part of deals. A vendor or purchaser may ask to get a record done as part of that deal to provide that peace of mind. And really, it's because of this fear of orders. And when we talk about sticks, it's those regulatory orders that are really the sticks and are the things that keep people up at night. So, in many provinces and territories, the ordering powers are very, very broad, both in terms of who can be ordered, so the people that are, subject to orders, but also the work that can be required under any given order. There's been an expansion of those order powers over, I would say, the past 10 to 12 years. We've really seen, especially in Ontario, the ministry order more people and require more work. Current owners, former owners, current occupiers, former occupiers, directors and officers, anyone with management and control, and the orderee does not have to have caused the contamination, right? So that's really the stick there. It doesn't matter that 3 owners before you caused the contamination, or worse, 3 tenants before you caused the contamination, you could be responsible for it. We've seen directors and officers of owners and occupiers be ordered, those subsequent property owners and occupiers who had no control or did not cause the contamination be ordered. There's a case in Ontario where the accountant who had power of attorney to sell a property was ordered. Real estate agent listing the property for sale, contaminated property for sale, was ordered. So it's very broad, and it can be quite the stick because these orders can require quite a bit of work and be very, very costly. I believe the North Star case was settled with the ministry for something like $4.75 million to do the cleanup work. And that order was against directors and officers. So they personally had to pay that money to do that cleanup work. So it can be quite the stick. And aside from sort of this legal framework that exists across the provinces and territories and federally within Canada, there's also sort of emerging policies and other areas that promote the redevelopment of contaminated sites, the cleanup of contaminated sites. And one of those that I wanted to touch on very quickly is ESG. And ESG is all about environmental social governance, about having positive impacts on the environment and on social aspects and society as a whole. And contaminated sites, contaminated properties really can fit within that ESG framework. And CBN recently just did a whole session on that. And having brownfields and redeveloping brownfields as part of a portfolio or as part of a business's operations can really feed into their ESG, criteria and help them access financing and funding that might otherwise be available. So that's another, outside of the legal framework, a policy direction that's really helping to promote brownfields as well.
Wow, that's a whole lot of good thought-provoking content. I mean, there's just so much there. I'm gonna put it to Krista. As a strategic advisor on contaminated site cleanup projects and a QP, what are the main strategies you employ when advising your clients? How are you helping your clients achieve that triple bottom line of financially, environmentally, and socially successful project results? And I think that can kind of build a little bit on what Joanna was talking about in terms of it's super complex. I think each time anyone speaks, we're getting more and more realization on just how much is involved in their long-term projects too.
Yeah, and I always say that something that is really important when you're approaching a contaminated site is to really think through the development of that site as a whole in a really holistic way. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we see made in the industry is when they start addressing the site as these individual discrete steps. And that really removes that possibility of looking for those opportunities to identify those cost-effective or schedule-effective redevelopment options. You do want to make sure your permitting process, so for example, in Ontario, the RC process that Joanna was speaking of, is closely linked to your design process. So you can look for where you can make tweaks in either place to really reduce your costs, improve your schedule, or to Joanna's point, better meet your ESG goals and targets for that site or for your corporation. And within that environmental permitting process itself, there are decisions made within each of those discrete stages. So be it the phase 1 or the phase 2 ESA or the RA, that can have really significant implications to the overall cost of the redevelopment program. So you want to make sure that you're really thinking through each of those decisions in those stages with that long-term view and in consideration of the overall goals and the development approach. Otherwise, if you're making decisions in each individual phase just to get through it as quickly as possible, and we see this sometimes, people are rushing to the RSC. They just want the RSC so they can get their building permit, and they lose that opportunity to think strategically through how the different outcomes of those phases are going to link in a way that can reduce those overall site construction costs. So I'd say really the main strategy is coming up with that overall, looking at that overall project in that holistic mind frame and looking for those opportunities to meet the project objectives in a coordinated way within each component of the work. And just to add on what Eric said, constructability is way too often an afterthought. It's for sure the last thing anybody thinks about after we've gotten through the permitting, the design. People start to actually think about how are we actually going to build it. So I agree with Eric. That is something that really does need to be introduced much earlier in the process so that that can also be part of that cost-effective solution.
Fantastic.
Go
ahead.
I'm just gonna jump in. I am.
Please do.
I'm a lawyer. I interrupt is what I do. So you can object if you want. I think, what we heard from Krista and what we heard from Eric is it's really that team approach. And when we're working on sites as legal and advising on risks, it is the consultant, the contractor, your planner. What can you build here? How can we maximize, the building structure and that to deal with the contaminated site and be efficient with our costs, right? And I think Krista's right. Too often you see people who are like, I'm just going to build this. And it's like, well, maybe an extra level of parking would help you. And, what does the planning let you do? And so I think there really is that holistic approach. And I think we've heard it from both of them. And it is really the best way to go.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and one thing I'd add when we talk about some of these things, and both Krista and Joanna mentioned it a little bit, especially with ESG, I would say, me personally, I'm surprised the degree to which projects still, and this is maybe where Reanne is going to speak a little bit, we're not seeing enough Indigenous content, and there are opportunities for more Indigenous collaboration, and we still see a lot of projects, big government projects, that don't actually speak to that, and I think that's a big piece of what we could improve upon in the next, call it 5 to 10 years, in terms of some of the contaminated sites work that we do.
Thank you.
We
That's
talk
actually
more
excellent.
about
I was just going to say that's an excellent segue. Reanne, if you would like to tell us a little bit about the academic research that you've got focused, which is exactly that, addressing environmental racism. Cleaning up contaminated sites is also an opportunity to address the environmental racism, the legacy of structural inequality, and provide energy sovereignty to Indigenous communities. So, I think that's perfect timing. You can hop in.
Yes, very, very good. Good segue indeed. So just a quick explanation of what environmental racism is. I'm sure many of us have maybe heard of it in passing, but environmental racism is the unequal protection of and the disproportionate exposure of hazardous materials on racialized individuals. Environmental racism is a form of state-sanctioned racial and gendered violence through which violent control over Indigenous and racialized bodies, space, and knowledge systems work to harm the economic, political, and social well-being of these communities. So the predominant institutional rules, regulations, and policies of government or corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for least desirable land uses, resulting in the disproportionate exposure of toxic and hazardous waste on communities based on biological characteristics. So we know that Black and Indigenous and people of color communities are exposed to 60% more pollution than they consume. And whites are exposed to less pollution than what we consume. And that stat is from the US, so I'm sure it's quite similar to Canadian context. In particular, environmental racism is also the result of the legacy of structural inequalities based on race, and in particular, the product of white supremacy and settler colonialism. Now, if you haven't quite heard of settler colonialism, that was the systemic removal of Indigenous people for land. Indigenous scholar Leanne Simpson says that the Indigenous people of Turtle Island have suffered 4 centuries of apocalyptic violence. So first it was the removal for their land, and now we're seeing the continued degradation of Indigenous land, being it industries encroaching on their territories, continued exploitation of resources, or the willful disregard of the threat of climate change. Sorry, I'm sick and I'm also very pregnant, so it's very hard to breathe. Sorry.
Take your time.
Yeah,
And
I'm
there.
trying to like give my lungs more space. So just some examples of environmental racism in Canada. There's Pictou Landing, First Nation in Nova Scotia. There's Africville in Nova Scotia. Fort McKay in Alberta, that's just north of the Athabasca tar sands. There's Grassy Narrows in Ontario, and the Amjiwang First Nation in Chemical Valley or Sarnia in Ontario. So there is a lot of examples out there. Now looking specifically in Indigenous communities on reserves, there's 1,979 contaminated sites out of 2,300 reserves. So that just shows the staggering amount of contamination on reserves. So it's clear that there's a disproportionate amount of brownfields and contamination in minority neighborhoods, but then there's a disproportionate amount of public money that's being spent in richer neighborhoods. So if we wanted to strictly look at this in an economic sense, worse off, we'll use that term, lightly, but if you stimulate economic growth through brownfields in marginalized communities, you're actually getting a better return on public money. So it's really important to, think of the social justice or the environmental justice. But when we're talking about policy spending, it actually makes more sense to stimulate these areas that actually need it. Their dollar will go further than a wealthy neighborhood that really doesn't need another Starbucks. My apologies if there's any Starbucks fans. So when we talk about environmental justice, it simply means embracing the principle that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection of environmental health, employment, housing, transportation, civil rights law. And social justice essentially means equity, fairness, and a place for all to exist in society. So you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with brownfields? Well, everything. And I think the previous speakers just alluded to, you need some holistic thinking. And so if you're bringing in those social pieces and really looking at those communities and what they need, you can be building a great future. So building on the themes of environmental justice and social justice, energy sovereignty would be building bright fields, so putting solar panels, or implementing other green energy into contaminated sites, especially communities that have suffered disproportionate burden. And we can also implement other SJ projects, gardens, green spaces, childcare, grocery stores, having spaces for NGOs or community enterprise centers. You can turn it into a health field, so having health services on site, or simply even just building a school. So if there's something missing in that community, thinking through that process of what I've just kind of outlined, brownfields can really help close that gap.
Thank you. We have a question actually from the audience. It's, I think, on topic. Many contaminated sites are on underdeveloped industrial areas or remote properties, legacy. Many are also in First Nations lands. Those are not these are not low-hanging fruit for developers. So what drivers are there to better address them?
I think one, just to jump in, is I think what we see in a lot of cases with our Indigenous partnerships and in some of the projects that we see is that there is actually a very large desire among Indigenous communities for economic reconciliation. And so of the 8 joint ventures that we have, I think 6 actually have an economic redevelopment component to it, where they're actually looking at redeveloping their land. So I think that's one driver. I do appreciate that in a lot of cases that driver may not exist, and so that's only one piece of that answer. I think there's other ones, and I'll maybe see if anyone else has any comments.
So I think there's a couple things. So one is going back to ESG, which is I think how we sort of started here, which was, there's benefits to companies, there's financing and funding that's being made available through the private sector, through banks and others, through green funds or blue funds or ESG funds or sustainable funds that can help make these projects more affordable or viable. And, it's good for companies if they are looking to be, have their ESG scores and such, to say that they're partnering with First Nations communities and doing this work and redeveloping these sites, right? So I think that's one way. The other way, unfortunately, sometimes is through litigation, and especially where it's an outside source that's caused the contamination. It's hard, right, with reserve lands, because it is treated differently than private land. I've been working on a file right now, and so I can't provide too many details, but there's not much out there in terms of impacts on Indigenous rights, for example. So where an industry or a mine or a project has impacted Indigenous land and Indigenous rights, there's not a lot of case law out there, and that's actually something that we're looking at this file, and it would be new and sort of groundbreaking. So maybe for another future webinar, but that's another area that can pick up on that issue and work on that. The other point I wanted to make is in northern Canada and the territories, a lot of this is dealt with very differently, not so much in the contaminated lands, although I do wonder if it will go there in the future. But in Nunavut, there's an obligation to get to an impact benefit agreement with the local Inuit community before you can do any project. And that really changes the power balance. And it really allows for those real negotiations to happen, so you can get things like ensuring that there's proper cleanup or reclamation after a project, ensuring that there is employment, that there's educational programs. In one case, we negotiated to have a retirement home constructed in the community, because otherwise everyone had to go to Edmonton, which was a couple-hour plane ride, and you're not going to go visit your elderly relatives a few hours by plane on a regular basis. So there are different structures in place in different places in Canada, and it's about, I think, learning from those and seeing how we can implement them in other jurisdictions across the country.
And I'll just add to that. I mean, I think that was really well said, and I can't say a whole lot on addition to that, but I always find that what drives contaminated sites development is often good policy and good regulation, a good framework that actually allows it to propel itself forward. And I think Joanna just pointed to reasons that it may not work and reasons that it can work. And so I think that is where we'd have to look to help drive some of that work forward as well.
All right, I am going to just put a little reminder out there to everyone right now. We have poll questions down at the bottom of the screen. You'll see the little word polls down there. Please have a look and upvote, if you will, or answer the questions. And we'll circle back to those a little bit later. I'm also going to switch gears and I'm going to pose to the whole panel, so everyone can jump in as much as they'd like. Although I might start with you, Krista. What do you think are the most effective ways to support contaminated sites cleanup? Do you think federal and provincial investments are sufficient? And can you see public-private partnerships playing more of a role? And Krista, I'll start with you, but please, everyone else, jump on in.
Yeah, and I would say, like I just said, from my time in the industry, what facilitates contaminated sites cleanup is the development of sound policy and regulation, as well as targeted investment and this piece of strategic site planning. And I do think we do have pretty good processes in place to facilitate and support redevelopment of contaminated sites, although there are definitely places where we could continue to work on improving, and we just discussed one of them, obviously. But really that's looking to address often risks in the process that would help people be more comfortable with taking on the redevelopment of contaminated sites. So helping to improve project timelines, things that could provide better certainty on outcomes, and also just continuing to look for innovative ways to address long-term liabilities and risks. But I think the foundation for it is generally there, and we just need to keep trying to refine it and push it forward. If there's anything else I would point to that would help further promote contaminated sites redevelopment, it is likely more expanded brownfield incentive programs. We do see those in some municipalities, and they are somewhat accessible, I think, at the federal level as well. But I think a further expansion of that would help. And then just also public policy that would probably aim to promote brownfield development over greenfield development. So, where we have infill space, where we have these undeveloped urban spaces that would be good targets for addressing housing issues, why would that not proceed before we sprawl further out into agricultural fields? So policy that kind of points that way. In terms of public-private partnership playing a role, there's certainly going to be opportunity for P3 arrangements to be a possible tool for addressing, I'd say, larger contaminated sites, and especially larger sites that are associated with significant infrastructure work. That seems to be where we see this work and see it work fairly well. But I do think that will remain a fairly limited tool for urban centers only.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things is if you look at brownfields, we've said for a long time that many of the bigger urban areas, they've kind of tackled it. It's now part of the redevelopment scenario, so it's not as significant as it used to be. I still think that some of the smaller areas have those legacy issues, and I think some of the remote sites within Canada is another area. So I think we have to start shifting some of our attention from the bigger urban areas and the green projects, many of which are great, and there's still lots of good work going on, in various harbors and waterfront areas. But some of these other communities, Reanne mentioned Grassy Narrows, there's a whole series of, abandoned mine sites. So I think we have to also keep our minds alive to some of these other areas within Canada that still have those legacy impacts.
Yeah, if I may just add, we do on the ground see a lot of brownfield redevelopment in municipalities through, looking at Ontario, a lot of the community improvement. So they have designated areas in urban spaces that can tap into extra brownfield funding and incentives in targeted community areas. I think that's a really great idea that should be spread across many urban spaces as well as rural spaces. I live in a very small town. There's brownfields, but the location is not that great. But we deserve nice things and not to live in contamination. And certainly other rural and remote sites have that too. So I think the absence of strong federal policy kind of hurts brownfields redevelopment writ large, whether it's simply decontaminated site or putting in innovative projects like health fields, energy, obviously, all sorts of things. And definitely public-private partnerships play a role, specifically when they're really driven with the community and for the community in mind. Oh, and just to add, I do believe that just the last month there has been environmental racism or environmental justice law being tabled in Parliament. So, maybe when those kind of laws and rights go through for thinking of environmental racism, brownfields might get a big boost up.
We have another question from our audience here, unless anyone else would like to jump on that one before I shift along a little.
I was going to, but why don't we go to the next question?
No, go for it. Jump in.
My only point was going to be, it's similar to the question we answered earlier, which is, and then I agree with what Eric said, urban centers sort of take care of themselves now. High value property takes care of itself. It's really the remote sites, and it's the sites that are very, very contaminated, where the liability is huge and where the costs are huge, and they may not match with the redevelopment potential of the site. And so, and I agree with Krista, right? The framework is there. Sites are getting redeveloped all the time. There's, maybe it takes too long or whatnot, but, there is something there. I think the difficulty is those sites that fit into the rural, not as valuable property, and the very, very contaminated. And I do think that will probably ultimately come down to a policy framework that allows those sites to be developed while somehow that liability is managed. And we saw Waterfront Toronto with that partnership between the provincial government and the municipality, and it helps to manage all of those liabilities as well, right? So I think that's the other piece of it that needs to be in place to get those sites redeveloped.
just a reminder that you'll see a whole bunch of links popping up in the chat box on the side here. And this is to reports, case studies, projects, all related to what our awesome panelists here are talking about. So be sure to check those out too. All right, so our question from the audience is, please comment. Contaminated sites on mine sites, in particular, what efforts, protocols to minimize or avoid mine site contamination occurring? So it looks like a little bit of a feedback on mining, please, from our illustrious panel. And Eric, this feels like it might be something up your alley.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of mine closures, there's a lot of work going on for mine closures. Some of the legacy sites, I think the key thing for new sites is obviously making sure that those are designed and go through the proper, permitting process. One of the things that I did many, many years ago for BC Ministry of Environment was they had a look at, will we be able to prevent contaminated sites in the future? And I think when I spoke to a number of their people in the ministry, they had the ability to make those decisions. They had the structure that we've talked about. It's the ability to actually hold true and make sure that those deposits and things are required, that the financial security is in place to prevent that. And if you look at some of the legacy sites, those are situations where the operator has walked away. So I think some of these discussions, while they feel like they're old and they've been going on for a long time, I still think they're relevant in terms of the context that we have within Canada. So yeah, I think the ability to clean up those sites, as Joanna said, we know we can clean up those sites. We know how to close them effectively. They are expensive, and so we need to make sure that those funds are available to execute on that work.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. So we deal with this in the north again, and that's where most of my mining work is. And there is security requirements and all of that to have the money put aside. And there are legacy sites where it wasn't done back at the time, and now there's huge issues associated with that. But even with more recent mine sites, right? I mean, you're asking a mining company who's coming in to start up, who hasn't even taken anything out of the ground yet, to now put this huge amount aside as financial assurance, as security for a potential cleanup if they go bankrupt or disappear. And it has to work value-wise in order to get the project off the ground. And so oftentimes that amount isn't enough to cover if that company goes bankrupt, depending where they are in the process of the mining operation. So it does still happen. There are those procedures in place to have the security, but we do find that it's sometimes not enough. And especially, mines are not in urban centers. They're out in remote sites, and Northern Canada has a ton of mines. And it is not easy to get there. It is not easy to get equipment there or back. And so it makes cleanup very, very difficult and very expensive.
Perfect. I'm going to hop over to the polls because there was a question there that reminded me that I'm curious to know who our audience is today. So which area of the contaminated site sector do you represent? If you haven't already, hop in here and answer the poll questions, please. Right now, we're looking at 21% of our voters as landowners. We got about 21% contractors. We got no lawyers here, so I'm afraid you're alone today. Consultants, we have 5, and we have academic. Well, sorry, not 5, but 21%. We have, it's going up. The numbers are increasing as we go. But generally speaking, I am curious to know what this other category includes. If anyone's voted in the other category, chuck your title into the chat box there, and we'll get a sense of who else we've got joining us today. And I'm going to scooch along to the next question I have. We've talked policy. I think it's unavoidable that we must talk about budget a little bit. In the budget 2022-2023 that provides for an investment of $357 million over the next 5 years to reclaim contaminated areas and rehabilitate land. This is to stimulate the energy transition and support sustainable practices. What is the best way for motivated industry stakeholders to mobilize these funds? And this question is for everyone. So who would like to hop in on that one first? Just start pointing if nobody jumps in.
I'll just start with a really broad answer, but I do expect this might be a place that corporations could look to their own ESG practices, policies, and targets and see how they can be achieved through these types of contaminated site projects. So it could be the metrics that are associated with accessing those funds are similar to the metrics that get established for ESG programs corporately. And so perhaps looking to demonstrate some alignment in those practices might be something that would help them access that funding.
Great, thanks. Reanne, would you like to hop in?
Sure. Obviously I kind of look at the big picture thing with funding, so hopefully I had to go back to the question. I was like, oh, did I misread the question? But I think federal funding and then through the chain, I guess, they should be tied to social justice outcomes, meaning remediation and end use should maximize outcomes for specific communities. So there are an example that I will hopefully get to talk to, but more in detail. But there was a community at a and they had school, they had no youth center, so they actually used FIXAP funding to clean up and put in a school. So that's great on the surface, but using those funding tied to outcomes will actually help reduce spending in other areas. So we should be thinking of using that funding to match or pair up with other departments or other programs in kind of a preventative or bundling investment. So and then looking, in urban areas, if we're building, for example, urban reserves on brownfield sites or infill, that real estate development is good for the community. There's now buildings being there instead of empty industrial lots. It's generating income for the First Nation. It's providing services and houses for their community, as well as the existing communities that live there. And then also, so setting aside the social outcomes, and I won't go through the big list, but then green energy is also key. Stopping future spills by, investing those cleanups and putting in green energies there is a no-brainer. So why are we spending money to clean up sites and then going and polluting them in the first place? And just a comment John put in the chat about the impacts of urban sprawl. So we always think about the environmental impact, but he actually put about, there's also psychological damage. So building better is not just, putting that Starbucks in the condos. It's putting in green spaces and trees, places for us to walk. We're just coming out of a pandemic where we really valued the outside space. So just thinking completely different in every facet, and brownfields should be no different.
Thank you. Any other comments on the budget or how that budget should be deployed?
Quickly.
Yeah, go for it.
No, I meant just it should be deployed quickly.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's true too. There's a lot of red tape, isn't it? Typically, it takes a while to get these things actually to being useful. Let's see, how are we doing for time? Well, we've got about 12 minutes left, so let's move on to. I have a question here about legislation geared toward cleanup projects. They vary from province to province. We touched on this a little bit right off the top, I think, of our discussion today. Where, in your opinion, is it easiest to get the job done, and where is it most difficult in terms of legal complexities and permitting it? I mean, Joanna, this question is obviously kind of perfect for you, but I would love to hear others' experiences as well, if there's comments to add.
I guess I'll jump in first with the sort of overview answer, but I'm not actually going to answer the question. Every province, every territory has its own legislation. It has its own framework. There are similarities between some of them. Some of them are different. Some are more complex. Some are more straightforward. Some rely more on the consultant's discretion. Some are more regulated. Most of the processes, your desktop report, your phase 1, your intrusive investigation or phase 2, and then your remediation report and your sign off, whatever that looks like, so that the property is quote unquote clean. I think it's really difficult to say what's the hardest and what's the easiest. I think it's so specific to a project. I think there are projects where, really regimented system works well for it. I think there are projects where you need more leeway because it's a bit different and out of the box. And I think, you know, we could have a who has got it worse competition between the different provinces and territories. But I think the reality is it is very project specific. And, you know, at the end of the day, every jurisdiction does have its own challenges in getting projects done and brownfields redeveloped. You know, sometimes clients say this is too prescriptive. We need to just get it done. It's taking too long. And sometimes clients are like, I don't have that reassurance that I know it was all done right and I can rely on that. And I don't have that sign off letter at the end of the day. So, you know, I think it's, you have what you have and you have to sort of work within that and manage your liabilities as you can within that process. But, you know, nothing's perfect, but, you know, everything to some extent is working because we are getting sites cleaned up across the country. So.
Okay. Reanne?
No, I mean, I think Joanna covered it. There's so much difference on each project. I mean, I think that's the daunting piece for owners and people that want to bring projects forward. And as we say in our contracting business, every site is different, every challenge is different, and it comes back to what Krista alluded to, is that holistic approach. I think you have to take time. You know, it's not always for the faint of heart. I think that's why there's still a place for the dialogue at the Canadian Brownfields Network, looking at each of the provinces and what groups can do. If we look at how many of the different provinces have come on board with, you know, brownfield focused groups within their regulatory environment, that's definitely increased over the last decade. And there's probably a focus now on taking those and making them more efficient. I think some of the work that BC and Ontario have done in terms of using the private sector and those approved professionals or you know, registered ability to look at those sites has helped in terms of speed and timeline of process. Lots more to be done, but some good steps.
I don't know. Oh, we are getting some more questions and comments here from our audience. I'm going to jump to the question. Looking into future, are there guidance documents to avoid contamination at industrial sites, sustainable practices to avoid site contamination? That's a good question. Anyone? You guys are so polite. Go for it.
I'll jump in on that one because I think there is a big legal side to that. And that is that, you know, the Environmental Protection Acts or Environmental Management Acts or however they're framed across the country really are aimed at that one thing in large part, right? So it's prohibitions on discharges, prohibitions on spills, requirements to immediately clean up spills, clean up discharges, report to the regulator so that they can ensure they have someone out there to see what happened, evaluate, make sure that what's being done is right, and then reporting back once the cleanup is done. So, you know, that is in place. There are, of course, also, you know, approvals and permitting for your air emissions, your water discharges, your wastewater discharges to ensure that what you're doing meets various effluent criteria or emissions criteria to reduce future contamination. So there is a whole legislative framework in place, which is its own 1 hour presentation, I would say, to try and prevent future contaminated sites. I think, you know, there's also things, you know, ESG and best management plans and things like that, where, you know, we regularly advise companies and their boards of directors to have environmental management plans in place, right? So what tanks do you have? How often are you inspecting them? When are you replacing them? What's your spills response procedure? Making sure your employees are trained on it. That's all, you know, a bit outside of the regulation, but part of your due diligence, because the reality is things happen. You know, pipes break, employees go rogue. You know, we've sort of seen it all. We saw a U-Haul truck one time drive into a gas pump and keep driving and created a big spill. And, you know, these things happen and you can't necessarily prevent them, but having plans in place to respond. So, you know, you've got your legislation prohibiting, and then when it does happen, accident on purpose, whatever, you have a plan in place to contain it and clean it up. So it doesn't become a legacy issue or a neighborhood-wide issue. You sort of get to it right when it happens and stop those long-term or bigger neighborhood-wide impacts.
And I would just add to that, like, so there's the legislation that kind of pushes it and then the planning attached to it. There's also engineering controls that get built into that as best industry practice. So you'll see often secondary containment systems. You'll see the protective barriers around things. So there's a lot of engineering that can also go into helping to reduce the possibility of those kind of accidents and releases as well, which feeds into that.
Perfect. All right. We have about 6 minutes left here, and there's a couple of other comments in our chat box here. I'd like to just remind everyone that this session, about 15 minutes after we wrap up today, it'll be available as a recording. So I can say this to our panelists as well. If we don't get an opportunity to answer all the questions, we are able to come back and add to this chat feature later on as well. So if we don't get everything, what I would like to do is get some final thoughts from everyone. But I also kind of want to know forward thinking a little bit. I mean, we have a lot of great projects as examples. We have a lot of great projects that hope to see done in the future, where there's like new legislation, new budgets, all kinds of good things. What is it going to take for us to be prepared for that growth? I mean, there's an impending skills shortage in sort of every technical category out there at the moment. What do we need to get in place in order to move forward in the next 5-10 years? I would love to get just a minute or two from each of you as your sort of final thoughts for the day on kind of looking forward to the industry. Krista, I keep picking on you first because you're my top left, so I just like it naturally. That's where I want to go first.
Yeah, so and I think you're right. I think every sector is struggling right now to have enough people to, move things forwards and deliver work. So but I'd say in the environmental sector and the green economy, or in associated with the green jobs, it is definitely true as well. I would say, I think part of our challenge is the lack of public visibility on this industry, on the green economy, and on what green jobs are. And I think the whole concept of green is vague. I think it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but in terms of specifically work or careers, and you can see from the different sort of people on this call and people attending the call, there's a lot of different pieces that fit into this green economy or this green structure, or just contaminated sites itself. But I don't know if you're a student coming through school right now, any of that exists. I don't think there's public visibility into this as an industry, to know that this is a viable and good career option, that there is purposeful work in this field. And so I think one of the things we need to do is really try and advertise this as a preferred career choice, that there is purposeful, valid, and work that can sustain and support you, which everybody needs right now, given how unaffordable everything is. And I think the other piece is that there is a constant need for innovation in this field. And I think we need to be really kind of purposely trying to emphasize drawing in the next generation of innovators, because that's who's going to help us solve these problems going forward.
Joanna?
That's a hard one to follow, Krista, on. Thanks. I think, I echo everything that she just said, but, I spend a lot of time talking to undergrad students and law students about what I do, because I agree they don't know. People are like, oh, environmental law, but they have no idea what it means. And, most people haven't heard of a brownfield site, I think, still. And so knowing that is an option out there. And I think, that educational component, I think for the general public, for students coming up, and also, with governments and policymakers, to say we need to support this, and, we need funding for researching innovative strategies to remediate, these worst of the worst sites, so that we can get it done, and we can get it done economically, and we can put them back into use. Strong policy that supports that funding, but also supports, getting this done in a reasonable way, in a time efficient way, in a cost efficient way, and in a way that manages people's liability, right? Because we certainly, I part of my job is doing deals, and we have people come in and they get the reports and they're like, oh, I don't want to touch that, because they're going to get sued, they're going to get ordered, and they don't want that liability. And so part of moving forward in the future is how do we manage that too for those sites.
All right, Reanne.
Well, just to add about, students and other newcomers don't even know about brownfields. I'd say that, there's a lot of municipalities and other sectors of government that don't even know about brownfields. So how can we be expecting them to kind of have a top-down approach when they don't even know that there's a problem that exists? But of course, part of the way I see things is I'm always trying to make these big connections. So, I think brownfields is the only thing that can hit on so many topics. And currently we're seeing that the status quo of urban development, or even just like Canadian life, is not working. There's urban inequalities that are happening that are far exponentially worse than they were 20 years ago. There's still toxic legacy sites in remote, rural, and urban centers. We're seeing housing shortages. We're seeing food insecurity. We're seeing energy dependence that is, leading to an apocalyptic climate change event that we're all going to suffer, specifically, the next generations. Urban sprawl not working for our cities, impacting our productivity to get to places, and of course our environment. We need childcare, schooling, green space, all of these things. And I truly believe that brownfields is something that can hit on every single component. Brownfields truly can completely change a city, an urban or rural space. So I think we just need to get creative in messaging and being part of the CBN, which pretty much all of us on the panel are. We are trying to push that conversation out there, and having panels like this, I think is the help. But brownfields are endless. The solutions are endless, and the creativity is endless as well.
Thank you, Reanne. All right, Eric, it's up to you to bring us home.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah,
pressure.
just three quick suggestions on that front. I mean, first, I think innovation. We need to keep looking at new ways of doing things. I think some of the old ways, I think we should be looking, Todd made a post and I commented on it. We should be looking at in situ and better ex situ options. I think the idea of continuing to landfill and truck material should be somewhat dated by now, but I know it has its place. But I think that those are areas where we could improve. I think the other aspect, Krista touched on it, was people. And one thing that we've been doing here, which I think has been very rewarding, just hire a co-op student, look to partner with other groups. They infuse your organization with new ideas and I gotta say, a brilliance and an attitude that is extremely refreshing. And man, they're smart, way smarter than I am. So hopefully our future is in better shape. And then the last one I would say, third point, is there's lots of need for collaboration. Events like this, we've talked about CBN. I think these things, it's only through discussing what the problems are and trying to come up with shared solutions that we really make that difference. And so I think these forums are great to bring up new ideas, and it's too bad there wasn't more time. But as I said in my one, and somebody had a great question about Namu, a site in BC. Follow up offline. Hopefully our information is available, and I think all of us would be happy to chat more with the attendees today.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists, and to Connie Vitello as well, the editor of Environment Journal, for her efforts in pulling this fantastic panel discussion together. We wouldn't be able to host important conversations like this one without the generous support of our industry. And with that in mind, I would like to extend another big thank you to today's sponsor, Milestone Environmental Contracting. If you haven't already, be sure to check them out online at milestoneENV.ca, and there are some links in the chat there to some of the stories and case studies that Eric mentioned earlier. Finally, a very big thank you also goes out to all of you, our attendees. Your participation through the chat feature and polls questions really infuses these events with a sense of community and wouldn't otherwise be possible. If you follow Actual Media at the top of your screen, you'll automatically get a notification for the latest information on upcoming webinars. Next week, we have another one already. On May 19th, we'll be hosting a discussion on environmental report writing. Challenges, best practices, and details you should know about. So keep that on your radar. Until then, thank you again, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.